Iberia and the end of Muslim Spain, the full history. Before Islam, Roman and Visigothic Iberia, c. 200 BC 711 AD. The peninsula that would become Spain and Portugal was incorporated into the Roman world over several centuries. Rome called much of it Hispania, and Romanization transformed its cities, roads, agriculture, language, law, and political institutions. After the Western Roman Empire fragmented during the 5th century, the Visigoths established a Christian kingdom centered on Toledo. By the late 7th century, the Visigothic monarchy controlled most of the peninsula. But Visigothic Spain was politically unstable. The monarchy suffered from succession disputes and struggles between powerful aristocratic factions. That instability would become enormously important. The Visigothic monarchy was not a centralized state in the modern sense. Kings depended heavily on alliances with powerful nobles, bishops, and military leaders, and succession was frequently contested. Instead of a stable hereditary system, the throne could become the prize in violent struggles among competing factions. Religious and social divisions also complicated the kingdom. The Visigothic ruling elite had originally followed Arian Christianity, while the majority of the Hispano-Roman population was Catholic. King Reconquista I converted to Catholic Christianity in 589, and subsequent Visigothic rulers increasingly sought to unify the kingdom around Catholicism. By the 7th century, bishops had become important political figures as well as religious authorities. The result was a kingdom that possessed a common Christian identity but remained vulnerable to internal conflict. The crisis of 710 to 711. The final crisis came after the death of King Witiza, probably around 710. The circumstances surrounding the succession are disputed, but a faction of the Visigothic nobility supported Roderick, who became king. Other factions appear to have opposed him. It was in this environment of civil conflict that forces from North Africa crossed into Iberia. The invasion was not simply an enormous army appearing out of nowhere. Muslim forces had already conquered most of the Maghreb during the preceding decades. The Byzantine presence in North Africa had been largely eliminated, and Muslim-ruled North Africa had become the launching point for further expansion across the western Mediterranean. In 711, a force commanded by Ṭāriq ibn Ziyād crossed the Strait of Gibraltar. The exact size of the army is uncertain, but it was probably composed of several thousand soldiers, many of them Berbers from North Africa. The name Gibraltar itself derives from Arabic Jabal Rik, meaning Mountain of Rik. Roderick moved south to confront the invasion. The decisive confrontation is traditionally identified as the Battle of Guadalete, although the exact location and details remain uncertain. Roderick was defeated and apparently died during or shortly after the battle. His defeat did not automatically mean that every part of Iberia had been conquered. Instead, the collapse of central Visigothic authority created an extraordinary opportunity. Muslim forces advanced rapidly through southern and central Iberia. Cities surrendered, local elites negotiated agreements, and some territories were incorporated through treaties rather than direct military conquest. Other communities resisted. This distinction is important because the conquest of Iberia was not a single event completed in 711. It was a process that unfolded over several years. By 718 to 720, Muslim armies had established control over much of the peninsula, although substantial Christian-controlled territories remained in the north. Why did the Visigothic kingdom collapse so quickly? The speed of the conquest has sometimes encouraged the idea that the Visigoths simply disappeared. They did not. The Visigothic political system collapsed, but the population of Iberia remained overwhelmingly composed of the people who had already lived there. Descendants of Romanized Hispano-Roman communities, Visigoths, Suebi, Basques, and other groups. Several factors probably contributed to the rapid political collapse. First, the kingdom was divided by a succession crisis at precisely the moment an external military force arrived. Second, Visigothic military power depended heavily on aristocratic networks. A king who lost the support of major nobles could struggle to mobilize the entire kingdom. Third, local elites had incentives to negotiate. If surrendering a city or territory allowed a landowner to retain property, status, or religious privileges, resistance was not necessarily the most attractive option. Fourth, the invading armies were experienced in warfare and benefited from the momentum of the larger Islamic expansion that had already transformed North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean. Finally, the Visigothic state had no strong institutional mechanism for recovering from the death or defeat of its king. Once Roderick's army was destroyed and political authority fragmented, there was no obvious successor capable of immediately reorganizing the kingdom. The conquest therefore became a chain reaction. Al-Andalus, c. 711 to 756. The territories conquered by the Muslims became known as al-Andalus. At first, Iberia was governed as part of the wider Umayyad Caliphate, with governors appointed through the political structures of the Islamic world. The conquest did not produce an immediate transformation of Iberian society. Christian communities continued to exist. Jewish communities also remained. Arabic gradually became an important language of administration, culture, and commerce, while Latin-derived Romance languages continued to be spoken throughout Christian and Muslim territories. Muslims themselves were not a single ethnic group. The armies and ruling population included Arab elites and large numbers of Berber converts and soldiers from North Africa. Over time, these groups developed their own rivalries, while the indigenous population underwent a complicated process of conversion, intermarriage, linguistic change, and cultural adaptation. The Christian kingdoms that survived in the northern mountains became the political base from which the long Christian reconquest would eventually develop. But calling the following century simply a continuous Christian war against Muslims would miss much of the reality. There were wars between Muslim rulers and Christian rulers, but there were also alliances between Christian and Muslim kings, civil wars among Muslims, rivalries between Christian kingdoms, marriages across political boundaries, commercial relationships, and periods of relative coexistence. The history of Iberia was therefore not a straight line. It was a centuries-long struggle over political authority in which religion was enormously important, but in which dynastic ambition, land, taxation, military power, trade, and local politics mattered as well. The Christian North and the birth of the Reconquista, c. 718 to 1000. One of the earliest Christian centers of resistance emerged in the mountainous northwestern region of Iberia. Tradition places Pelagius, or Pelayo, at the center of the resistance in Asturias. The Battle of Covadonga, traditionally dated to around 718 to 722, later became an important symbol of Christian resistance. The actual scale and significance of the battle are debated, but the Asturian kingdom survived and gradually expanded. Over subsequent centuries, several Christian political centers developed across northern Iberia. Asturias evolved into Leon. Navarre emerged in the western Pyrenees. Aragon and the Catalan counties developed farther east. Castile began as a frontier region associated with the Kingdom of Leon before becoming an increasingly powerful political entity of its own. Portugal eventually emerged from the western Christian frontier. These kingdoms did not operate as a single unified Spain. There was no medieval Spanish nation-state steadily marching southward. Instead, Iberia contained multiple Christian and Muslim states whose borders changed constantly. The word Reconquista, meaning reconquest, became a powerful description of this centuries-long process, but the term itself was applied retrospectively. Medieval Christians certainly understood their wars through religious ideas of recovering Christian territory, yet the actual political process was much more complicated than a single uninterrupted campaign. Sometimes Christian kingdoms fought one another. Sometimes Christian rulers allied with Muslim rulers against other Christians. Sometimes Muslim rulers fought other Muslim rulers. And sometimes populations changed rulers without being expelled from their homes. The Iberian Peninsula was becoming a frontier society where political, religious, and cultural boundaries overlapped. The Caliphate of Córdoba, 756 to 1031. A major transformation occurred in 756 when Abd al-Rahman, a surviving member of the Umayyad dynasty that had been overthrown in the Eastern Islamic world, established an independent Umayyad emirate in Córdoba. For the next 2.5 centuries, Córdoba became the center of one of the most powerful states in Western Europe. In 929, Abd al-Rahman III proclaimed himself caliph, creating the Caliphate of Córdoba. At its height, Córdoba represented a major center of political power, scholarship, commerce, architecture, and culture. The Great Mosque of Córdoba became one of the most famous monuments of Islamic Iberia. But the brilliance of Córdoba should not be confused with political permanence. The caliphate depended on a sophisticated but fragile political system. Military factions, ethnic rivalries, court politics, and regional ambitions gradually weakened central authority. In 1031, the Caliphate of Córdoba collapsed. The political map of Iberia fragmented once again. The peninsula entered the era of the Taifa kingdoms, dozens of smaller Muslim-ruled states competing with one another and with the Christian kingdoms to the north. This fragmentation would profoundly change the balance of power. From Muslim political dominance to Christian expansion, c. 1031 to 1212. The collapse of the Córdoba Caliphate did not mean the end of Muslim civilization in Iberia. In many respects, the Taifa period produced extraordinary cultural achievements. But politically, fragmentation created opportunities for the Christian kingdoms. Christian rulers increasingly demanded tribute, known as parias, from weaker Muslim states. Wealth flowing north strengthened Christian monarchies and helped finance armies, fortifications, and further expansion. The capture of Toledo by Alfonso VI of Leon and Castile in 1085 was a major turning point. Toledo had been one of the most important cities of al-Andalus and had once served as the capital of the Visigothic kingdom. Its capture demonstrated that the balance of power was shifting. Alarmed Muslim rulers appealed for assistance from the Almoravids, a powerful Berber dynasty based in North Africa. The Almoravids crossed into Iberia and defeated Alfonso VI at the Battle of Sagrajas in 1086. For a time, they reunited much of Muslim Iberia under their authority. Later, the Almohads, another North African Berber movement, established their own empire across much of the Maghreb and al-Andalus. The struggle therefore became part of a larger Western Mediterranean conflict involving North Africa as well as Iberia. The decisive Christian breakthrough came after the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212. A coalition led by the Christian kingdoms of Castile, Aragon, Navarre, and Portugal defeated the Almohad forces. The consequences were enormous. Over the following decades, Christian kingdoms conquered most of the remaining Muslim territories in central and western Iberia. By the middle of the 13th century, the Muslim political presence had been reduced to one major state: the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada.